I will start with the end of the talk. Because I may be stopped before, and I don't want you to be leaving the room without at least having my conclusions in your head, even if the details will not all be there if I won't have the time. And secondly, because I think it is an important kind of a cover for the whole Balfour project that we are involved in and hope to advance in Britain in the next few years. No other international power was involved in the fate of Palestine and the Palestinians as much as Britain was. Between, I would say, 1840 to 1948. We have 108 years, maybe 109 years, because I think it starts in 1839 to be precise. We have 100 years in which, with some exceptions of course, and gaps, in which Britain is more interested in the future of Palestine than any other European power. And as the Ottoman Empire reaches its end on the historical stage, Britain becomes even more involved. And when Britain leaves Palestine, it leaves the Palestinian people in total disarray, with half of their villages destroyed, half of their towns demolished, and half of the people exiled as refugees. And that's how Britain leaves the Palestinians to face even a more formidable alliance than the Balfour Declaration represented, the alliance between Britain and the Zionist movement. In 1948, they have to face the Zionist movement, the United States of America, and European guilt about the Holocaust. And they reach that moment in history totally weakened and already defeated, not only by the Zionist movement, but also by Britain. And I think it's very important for us to understand, as historians at least, or those who are interested in history, how this British interest in Palestine develops, and why is it so anti-Palestinian? Why is it so pro-Zionist? And even before Zionism is invented, the British are pro-Zionists. That's an amazing historical phenomenon. In 1839, I can bring you pro-Zionist ideas of British philosophers, thinkers, and politicians before even one Jew in Eastern Europe thinks about Zionism. So there's something deeper than supporting few Jews who think that they are returning back home, which is the narrative you're used to hear. That is not true. There was a British Empire that wanted Palestine to be part of the British Empire, long before Jews thought of coming back to what was or wasn't their ancient homeland. And I think this is a missing narrative, this is a missing aspect of history which explains, even today, I think, our inability to push forward a genuine pro-Palestinian British position from above. I know that the civil society is pro-Palestinian, but show me a real group of politicians and policymakers who would dare to say, in 2014, after everything we know, that they are pro-Palestinians. There isn't such a group. And I think it all starts with Christianity, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on one's point of view. Being a devout Christian did not necessarily mean that you have to occupy Palestine. I think you know that. Although the Crusaders somehow missed that lesson. But it's good to go back to St. Augustine, who said, sorry, so many. You wired me. Where is this guy who wired me? You're not from the Mossad, are you? St. Augustine wrote, "The task is not to cross the sea, nor to undertake a lengthy pilgrimage. Both when we come to church and when we stay at home, let us earnestly call on God." But alas, early on, for most of those who represented politically the power of Christianity in the world, pilgrimage meant a very long stay in the Holy Land, longer than the indigenous population could have tolerated. And in many ways it begins with Empresses Helena, who started in the 4th century this Christian fashion of pilgrimage that became a kind of a religious duty, not just one additional way of expressing your religiosity. Pilgrimage, including from the British Isles, took a different meaning during the time of the Crusader, as we know. And it's interesting that the Crusaders had in their ideology 2 elements that will be reincarnated with the British Zionist alliance in the 20th century. One was, if you want really the Holy Land to be Christian, you have to get rid of the local people. That the local people are an obstacle for implementing a religious duty. And the second one was that if you want it to be purer, you have to bring new people instead of the local people. Now, of course, the Crusaders did not think about the Jews, because the Jews, during the time of the Crusaders, were seen by them as Palestinians, those who lived in Jerusalem and so on. But it was very interesting that they acknowledged that the land was inhabited, that there were local people, and yet that these people, if you are a devout Christian, had no right to be there. And it took a Brit by the name of Robert the Monk to write the following: "Let the holy sepulchre of the Lord our Savior, which is possessed by unclean nations, especially in situ, and the holy places, which are now treated with ignominy and irreverently polluted with their filthiness, enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. This royal city, therefore, situated at the center of the world, and is in subjection of those who do not know God, to the worship of the heathens." A very strong anti-Islamic sentiment that would dominate British policy for the next centuries. And when people ask, where is this all anti-Christian emotions come today and in the last century among political Islamic movements, should understand that history begins every time with a period that precedes it. So you have 7 or 8 centuries of Islamophobia, of anti-Islamic sentiment expressed without any inhibitions. And maybe you'll understand a bit better the backlash, not justified in its form, not justified in its brutality, but more understandable if you take the longer historical view, but most people don't like to take the most. What can you do? That's my lament as a history teacher. I'm just sharing with you some of my frustrations, not all of them. The exciting and at times disturbing theological religious upheavals in the Christian world during the 17th century produced another wave of, I would say, Christian interest in Palestine, and to the disadvantage of the local people. And this was, of course, the emergence of the millennialist movements. Again, central figures among these ideologues came from these isles. One of them was Thomas Brightman. Thomas Brightman was one of the first one in the 17th century to add another element to the 2 elements that the Crusaders have put in the Western psychology about Palestine. As I said, there were 2 elements. One is the local people cannot be there, and secondly, you need new people. Brightman was one of the first one who said the new people should be the Jews, because if they come back, they precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, and they create, or they are part of a divine scheme that by the very return is being enacted on the ground. If you want 17th century Christian Zionism, we know how it acted later on. As we learned from the time of the Crusaders, and we know it as historians, we are not impressed every time we read something like that. It really, we know that what you need is military power, political will, and economic resources to translate such an idea into reality. And if you seek the location of the Balfour Declaration on the historical axis of time, It is the moment when the will, the power, and the resources were there to implement a far more ancient idea than we usually think of, that has these three elements. No for the local people, yes for new people, and they have to be Jewish if you want to complete the picture. The British more modern form of millennialism, with such devastating effect on Palestine, re-emerged once more in the early 19th century. A powerful theological and imperial movement that would not be responsible for the emergence of Zionism and its arrival in Palestine, but would put all the elements, turn the Zionist movement in such a negative element in the life of the Palestinian. A simple history of ideas leads us directly from the fathers of this Christian Zionist movement in the 19th century to the politicians of the early 20th century who would implement these ideas as they came to be articulated in the Balfour Declaration. The arguments, and I think we can start this history of idea with someone many of you know, and this is Lord Shaftesbury, who campaigned actively for a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the mid-19th century. His arguments for a greater British presence in Palestine were both religious and strategic. And this mixture of religious argumentation and strategic argumentation would continue to dominate British self-explanation. Why do we ignore the Palestinians on the ground, and why do we push the Jews of Europe to colonize Palestine? It's kind of a dangerous blend that would lead from Shaftesbury active days in the midst of the 19th century to the ultimate act of British perfidy, the Balfour Declaration. Shaftesbury was responsible for another formula which I think Balfour perfected in his declaration. When the return of the Jews ceased to be a heuristic idea and transformed into a colonial project, namely, you did not only talk about a kind of a divine scheme by which Jews come back and the dead resurrected and the second coming of the Messiah. When you start to deal with the nitty-gritty of allowing the Jews to settle in Palestine, you have to sustain the project even if you understand that actually the timetable of the divine scheme is maybe for another 1,000 years, right? I mean, a theological clock does not work like a historical work, or divine clocks. What is for God 1,000 years? It's a mere second. So he meant that, of course, after they return, it can take 1,000 years before all the other pieces in the puzzle fall, and we are all in good or better, depends on our relative location in this scheme. But you had to put aside in many ways the theological discourse. And then you start building all kinds of other argumentation why actually you allow the Jews to, not only allow, you encourage them to come to the Ottoman provinces of Palestine. You help them to stay there because they don't have the means, as long as the Ottoman Empire is there, to stay. And it depends on your point of view. You either try to convert them already to Judaism, if you are a bit impatient with the work of God. And if you are a patient believer, you say, let them be still Jews for the next 3 or 4 generations. And anyway, it's not our role in life to do this. And you can see a direct link between British decisions, such as to found an Anglican bishopric in Jerusalem in 1839, and to build a cathedral even in Jerusalem, and how it's connected to the Zionist project. It's quite amazing. You would think these are all sort of Christian projects which have nothing to do with Zionism. But read carefully the documentation around these two projects, and you see that the return of the Jews was supposed to be helped by the bishop of Jerusalem and by the building of that cathedral, the first one out of many other institutions that would be built in Jerusalem. Now, every visionary needs a politician relative, or relative as a politician. and to make him an important historical figure. And I think Shaftesbury himself was not that important. I think it was his sister, not married, had he not married the daughter of Lord Palmerston, who was Britain's foreign minister and later Britain's prime minister, so definitely an important figure in the mid-19th century. And this is what Shaftesbury writes in his diary in 1838. Dined with Palmerston. After dinner, left alone with him, propounded my schemes, which seems to strike his fancy. The scheme was to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He asked questions and readily promised to consider it. How singular is the order of providence, singular if estimated by man's ways. Palmerston had already been chosen by God to be an instrument of good to his ancient people, to do homage to their inheritance, and to recognize their rights without believing their destiny. It seems he will yet do more, though the motive be kind, it is not sound. It is not sound, and this is a Chinese computer. I am forced to argue politically, financially, commercially. He weeps not, like his master, over Jerusalem. No praise that now at last she may put on her beautiful garments. End of quote. As a first step, Shaftesbury persuaded Palmerston to appoint the fellow restorationist, William Young, as the first British consul in Jerusalem. So the first British consul in Jerusalem had a brief not just from the British government, but had a brief from God to bring the Jews to Palestine. When he heard about this appointment, Shaftesbury wrote in his diary, "What a wonderful event it is. The ancient city of the people of God is about to resume a place among the nations, and England is the first of the Gentile kingdoms that ceases to tread her down." A year later, in 1839, Shaftesbury wrote a 30-page article for the Quarterly Review entitled "State and Restoration of the Jews." In it, Shaftesbury predicted a new era for God's chosen people. He insisted, and I quote, "The Jews must be encouraged to return in yet great number and become once more the husbandmen of Judea and Galilee. Though admittedly a stiff-necked, dark-hearted people and sunk in moral degradation and ignorance of the gospel, they were not only worthy of salvation, but also vital to Christianity's hopes of salvation." Anti-Semitism did not cause a problem for anyone who supported the return of the Jews to Palestine. Shaftesbury's gentle lobbying of Palmerston proved successful. For political reasons, and not so much for religious reasons, Palmerston became an advocate of Jewish restoration, as it was called in those days. Among other factors that came into play in his deliberation about British support for the Jewish return was, and I quote from him, "the view that the Jews could be useful in buttressing the collapsing Ottoman Empire, thus helping to accomplish the key object of British foreign policy in the area." Namely, whatever was the key factor in British strategy, and those of you who are familiar a bit with British imperialism know that until the 1880s, keeping the empire together, the Ottoman Empire together, was the key British strategic objective, because they felt that if the empire collapses, a world war could start. And after 1882, they decided that it's going to collapse anyway, and Britain was the first to bite into the dominions in that area of the empire. In whatever strategy, or whatever was the strategy, liberal or not liberal, that the British policymakers adopted, a Jewish state fitted well into that strategy. And there was not one scenario that they're bringing in which the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine is not a good one. Palmerston wrote to the British ambassador in Constantinople in 1840. It concerned the mutual benefit he wanted the ambassador to convey to the Sultan that Britain and the Ottoman Empire would have, in his words, for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Ironically, the anti-Muslim sentiment that really informed British policy at the time did not include the disintegration of the only Muslim empire you had. The Muslim empire had to stay intact, but it would be less dangerous if in its midst would be a Jewish state. That was the idea. And that's what he wrote to the ambassador. There exists at the present time among the Jews dispersed over Europe a strong notion that the time is approaching when their nation is to return to Palestine. He writes it in 1840. If he would have written this essay in my university, he would get an F. In 1840, there was no notion among Jews in Europe, neither strong nor weak, that the time is approaching that they should come back to Palestine. He invented it because he wanted to strengthen the case. I'm going back to his letter. It would be of manifest importance to the Sultan to encourage the Jews to return and to settle in Palestine, because the wealth which they would bring with them would increase the resources of the Sultan dominions and the Jewish people, if returning under sanction and protection at the invitation of the Sultan, would be a check upon any future evil designs of Muhammad Ali, the leader of Egypt, who wanted to push away the Sultan, or his successor. I have to instruct Your Excellency strongly to recommend to the Turkish government to hold out every just encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine. So all this narrative that you know of Herzl coming to the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, and he doesn't even want to see him, and he doesn't want to support the Zionist project in Palestine. Two generations before, the Sultans were already aware that there is a British project to create a Jewish state. Days after Lord Palmerston sent his letter, a lead article in the Times appeared, and it reported that there is a British plan to plant the Jewish people in the land of their fathers. And it was claimed that such a plan, and I quote, is under serious political consideration, and commending the efforts of Shaftesbury as the author of the plan, which it argued was practical and statesmanlike. Lady Palmerston supported her husband's stance. She wrote to a friend, always good to see a gender side to this. Women are more honest. And that's what she writes to her friend. We have on our side, listen to this, we have on our side, and this was written in 1840, not today, we have on our side the fanatical and religious elements. Our side is those who support the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, right? This is not mine, right? We have on our side the fanatical and religious element, and the first politician of stature to attempt to prepare the way for Jews to establish a homeland in Palestine. This had very little to do with new evangelical identity or collective identity. It had a lot to do with practical ideas of how to turn Palestine into a Jewish state long before the Zionist movement emerged as any movement of significance. It may, for some of them, some of these politicians, some of these pundits may have been more benign in their motives, I don't know, but definitely the way they talked and the influence they had eventually on the British government had all the ingredients to create the kind of catastrophe that eventually befell the Palestinian people. I should add to this that towards the end of the 19th century, another element comes into the picture, which makes it even more difficult for anyone in Europe or in Palestine to voice an alternative idea. And this is the Pietist movement in Germany. Some of you have heard probably of the Templars. I won't go too much into details. I would just say that out of the religious wars in Germany in the 19th century came a German colonization project of Palestine. I don't know how many of you are aware that the Germans colonized part of Palestine just a little time before the Zionists came. And the movement was called the Templars. And their discourse was also very pro-Zionist. They saw themselves as a movement that should help also Jews to come and colonize Palestine. One German scholar called it the Quiet Crusade. They were less talkative than the Zionists. They didn't declare on left and right what they're going to do, but they did it. Of course, they didn't have the Templars, that they really played an important role in deepening the Zionist colonization in Palestine. In 1948, when the Palestinians were cleansed, also the Templars were thrown out of Palestine. A kind of a lesson, maybe. The German-British cooperation produced a lot of institutes. I won't go into it, but a lot of institutes, educational institutes, economic ventures, political organizations that in between 1845 until almost 1900 were meant to create the infrastructure that would allow the Jews to have a permanent presence in Palestine. A very important figure in this story is someone, and I hope again the name may be familiar to some of you, was a consul in Jerusalem called James Finn. I don't know if any one of you heard the name. Now, James Finn, who was from the 1840s, the consul in Jerusalem, saw his main brief as, first of all, the conversion of Jews to Christianity, and when this didn't work, facilitating the return of the Jews to Palestine. His main importance was that, unlike his predecessor, and with the help with the local bishop, Michael Solomon Alexander, they both understood that if you want the Jewish return to become a reality, you have to purchase land for them. You have to create a political institution that would support them. He was so active in this that he, not surprisingly, has a very respected place in the pantheon of Zionist historiography. You won't find him in the Palestinian historiography for understandable reasons. He is also interesting because he's the first one who encounters what I would call the initial Palestinian or original Palestinian response to the new realities that Britain is helping to create in Palestine in the late 19th century or from the mid-19th century onwards. The notables of Palestine, the urban notables of Palestine, were, for better term, the political leadership of the Palestinian community. They were very slow in reacting. They were not always aware of their need to represent what nowadays we would call a nation. Nobody talked in terms of Palestinian national movement in those days. But some of them were very bright and understood that what they are witnessing is something that can have wider implications for their existence, not for their influence, not for their standing in a society. And if you read the letters that one of the most important notable, the Mufti, Musa al-Husseini, writes to the Ottoman Parliament in the late 19th century, this is a fascinating reading. I don't have time to go into it. I will just summarize it. In which he says, what I'm witnessing here is a British support for a movement that would cause the destruction of Palestine. He is not worried about more pilgrims coming. He's not worried about more European presence in the city. These are all things that he witnessed in his lifetime. It didn't worry him. He understood, maybe better than the Zionists themselves, that the potential that was in it. Now, let me finish by going over time to the beginning of the 20th century and say that despite of the Mufti and the others' protestation, of course, the more we move to the moment when Britain realizes it's going to occupy Palestine, the more practical the British support for the Zionist movement is. But it has these historical layers, theological layers and ideological layers on which it rests. And it's very important to understand. And I think the moment, the really sort of moment with this I would strive to end this, is 1903. The British play with different ideas that they hear from the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement is not focused on Palestine until 1903. It asked the British to help them to establish Jewish colonies in different parts of the world. They want a safe haven. They don't necessarily need Palestine at this point. And as you know, in 1903, the big trophy Britain can offer is Uganda. But when Uganda falls as an option, contrary to the wishes of the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, that's the moment that all these historical chapters from the past gel into a pro-Zionist, strong pro-Zionist British idea. Because from that moment onwards, you have people in all the section of the British military and diplomatic and strategic apparatus that begin to work together as a cabal within the policy-making structure of the British Empire to work towards facilitating a direct British help for creating a Jewish state in Palestine. People like Mark Sykes, Herbert Samuel, Lord Balfour, long before they came who they became, were already working with the Zionist movement. And at one point in 1914, even in 1912 actually already, the Zionist movement convinces the British government to allow these people to work, if you want, after office hours for the Zionist cause. After Chaim Weizmann is presented as almost the savior of Britain in the First World War with his scientific innovations, he's even allowed to ask them to work during office hours for the Zionist cause. And they become a formidable force. And they do eventually create that kind of path directly to the Balfour Declaration. After the Balfour Declaration was granted, two things happened in Britain, and this one sentence each. Don't be worried, Roger. It's just one sentence each, and with this I finish. One was some of the people who were involved in the Balfour Declaration, most notably Mark Sykes, came for the first time to Palestine. And what they saw made them to retract totally of the previous support for the Balfour Declaration. 5 minutes on the ground, this would sound familiar to you. 5 minutes on the ground, and they had a different perspective on Palestine. And they regretted mainly the kind of things they have written on the local population, which in one sentence was, they're not important, they're not significant. There were 91% of the population were Palestinians, were insignificant, they do not constitute a problem. The second thing, they tried to create what today we will call the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. They call it the Arab Center. And there's a book that I know that Carl Sabar soon will come and publish by one of them, Joseph Jeffries, which was called The Reality in Palestine, a book published in 1938. And that book begins by saying the following, I quote quickly from memory because I don't have time to read the quote. More or less he says that the number of people in Britain that support the Palestine cause is pitiful small. Secondly, he said, it will never have the resources, the power base, and the influence that the pro-Zionists have in this country. And it's amazing, he says, that after, and that he says in 38, imagine what we would say today, that with all the things that we know today about Palestine, today means 1938, we are unable to move one politician on our side. The fact that so many years after we are sitting here, I think most of you, I don't know all of you, most of you are part of a similar Arab Center, and I'm proud to be part of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We have not succeeded in changing fundamentally the British support for the Zionist cause at the expense of the Palestinians. Thank you very much.